This is an image from the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. And we're having a much better sense now of kind of the origins of where experiences like depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety come from. But we've had much less attention to the experiences of those individuals that support others in distress. That can be a consoling friend or a loved one, but there are a host of different relationships ranging from traditional healers to community counselors, doctors, ritual performers, and individuals like me, psychiatrists, that provide services. So why do we deliver the care we do, and are there ways to improve that process? So if we think from an evolutionary perspective, we understand that a lot of the feelings associated with distress have a social origin to the emotional disruption. And often that is some form of either perceived or experienced or anticipated social rupture of some kind. When this happens, there are a host of different individuals within a particular group that help alleviate that stress and engage in social repair. And through our increasing understanding of aspects of multi-level selection, the components of group selection, we would think that anything that led to the evolution of behaviors that would contribute to displaying distress need a corollary behavior within a group to reduce that distress in some way. So there's kind of side-by-side processes. If we think about it, language, we can have language production, but we also need language reception. So when we look at consoling and supportive behaviors that form the foundation of psychological support, for many social mammals, that is in the form of touch, the most basic form of consoling, or more advanced forms of touch, such as allo-grooming, which we see in chimpanzees. But touch-based consolation can be seen in everything from rats to elephants. For human beings, there's a host of ways that we provide consolation. That can be through touch, that can also be through symbolic rituals, that can be through providing mutual support, and of course we have language that has evolved for us to find ways to help individuals understand suffering and hopefully alleviate that suffering as well. So this is an adaptation from DeWall and Preston, trying to put a little bit of an anthropological lens on his understandings of helping behaviors. So when a social group member experiences distress, an individual in that social group, through processes of emotional contagion, mirroring, and mentalization, has an aspect of shared affect. Some of the same brain regions are triggered related to anxiety, anger, and other feelings. However, that individual within the group is able to engage in their own emotional regulation, predominantly through frontal lobe functions. And then, whether it be through touch or in terms of humans, through much more elaborated aspects of such as symbolic manipulation, we are able to engage in distress reduction in that group member. And we know that when we engage in supportive behaviors of other group members, there's a self-reward process. So we have both physiological and physical, psychological and physical benefits that reinforce those behaviors and lead to perpetuation of supporting others within our group. We know, though, that doesn't apply to everyone. And increasing research, whether it be from sports to other psychological experiments, show that an unfortunate aspect of humans is that we also easily feel pleasure or potentially joy or positive affect at the suffering of others that perceive to be out-group members. So we don't ubiquitously engage in this psychological supportive behavior because for certain individuals, they are perceived to be not part of the same group. So this may be because an individual is identified with another tribe, community, nationality, ethnicity, whatever it may be, or it may be because an individual within a group has engaged in a behavior that leads to social ostracization, and an individual is no longer considered a group member in some way. Unfortunately, mental health is kind of the universal, mental illness is kind of the universal out-group experience. So individuals within a community who express especially symptoms of serious mental illnesses are often no longer seen as group members who receive the same levels of compassion. I've seen this expressed in diverse ways in different cultures around the world. In 2010, when I began working in Liberia, this was a time when a former minister, Jenkins Scott, was found living on the street, who probably had dementia. But in all of the newspapers, the presentations were that this was an individual who during the 1990s and the Doe administration had been responsible for mass atrocities and mass killings. And so people saw mental illness as a punishment that was put upon him because of the bad deeds that he had done. And this type of idea is often seen in many cultures, that mental illness is a punishment for social infractions of some kind. Unfortunately, just training individuals on understanding the origins of mental illness and the treatment of mental illness is often quite ineffective to be able to combat these stigmatizing attitudes. This idea that people with mental illness are not part of the group and are a threat in some way. These are some data from World Health Organization trainings of primary care workers in 4 countries, Ethiopia, India, Nepal, and South Africa. And what we see is that a week-long training in learning how to provide mental health services didn't actually improve the belief that people with mental illness are violent most of the time. In fact, in India, it got worse. So more of the health workers felt that people with mental illness are violent most of the time after the training. Basically, this is also responsible likely for a lot of the poor outcomes we see in a lot of initiatives around the world in trying to improve access to mental health services. Very rarely is there a wide uptake of that by, say, primary care or community health workers in global health initiatives. Here we see that in most countries, fewer than 10% of people with depression are actually detected after a primary care worker is trained to be able to deliver that service. So thinking from an evolutionary psychiatry perspective, and these ideas around group membership, and also the idea that in order to express empathy, we would need to have some similar experiences. We wanted to try something different in our work in Nepal and various countries around the world. Basically, we started with the idea that checklists don't evoke empathy. So simply a knowledge-based idea on understanding mental illness wasn't going to be adequate to engage people to be able to provide services. What we did instead was use a participatory research methodology called photo voice, in which we work with people living with mental health conditions in Nepal, Ethiopia, Uganda, Tunisia, China, a host of other settings, to be able to tell their stories of living with a mental health condition, getting treatment, and experiences in the community, predominantly using photographic narratives. And this can be done even with individuals who are illiterate. And the idea is that these narratives be a way that people living with mental health conditions can evoke empathy from potential care providers. It's a way to use social engagement through these photo narratives to reduce survival threats, social threats, professional threats that are associated with viewing individuals as out-group members, which then hopefully leads to actually the reigniting of an empathic response and then hopefully helping behaviors. So what we've done is turn a typical 10-day mental health training of primary care workers using these WHO resources to actually include much more interactions with people living with mental health conditions and their photographic life narratives. I want to give an example of one of these. This is a much abbreviated version, but hopefully give you a sense of what happens. So these are a series of photos taken by an individual living with alcohol use disorder in southern Nepal. He worked with our team and other people living with mental health conditions to develop these 5 or 6 slides to be able to tell a 10 to 15 minute story and then interact with people who are being trained in primary care settings. He begins his story by saying that this is a local shop in his community. And by doing this, he connects with the healthcare providers, many of whom probably often use the same shop. He describes how he would see others in the community come into this facility and buy snacks for their kids, cleaning supplies for their spouses, but that when he was in the worst states of his addiction, he would spend all of the family's money on alcohol. Everything that he had earned at his job as a painter was spent on beer and liquor. This is then a photo of his house. So it gives a way for people to understand where he lives in that community. And he says that in the experience of alcohol use disorder, he would often become even violent. This is important because it acknowledges that some of the stereotypes, some aspects of stereotypes may have a grounding in reality, but it also puts it in light of a broader context of experiences. So he said that he would become violent at times, and at one time broke a window in the kitchen of his house. He also shows then a picture of these two bridges in his community. And he says that everybody knows he always takes the bridge in the back, the railings on it, but sometimes when he was intoxicated, he would go across this bridge in the front, and he did that once and fell off of it and actually broke his wrist and couldn't paint or earn any money for a couple of weeks. He then says, but these are the healthcare providers in our community. This is a community health volunteer, a community counselor, and a community primary care worker. He refers to these three women as his three Devis, or his three goddesses. And he says that the community health volunteer came to him and told him that what he had was actually a disease, it was an illness, and that there was something that could get treatment at the primary care facility. He then worked with the primary care doctor for detoxification. And then after that, he went through about 2 months of therapy with the community counselor. He says, in our community, we always want to be able to have goats as a sign of wealth and status, but also something to show that you're a good provider for your family. In Nepal, there's a holiday festival, typically in October or November, when the family sacrifices a goat as part of that ritual. And that for many years, when he was in the depths of his addiction, he wasn't able to earn enough money to be able to purchase a goat because he was spending it on alcohol. And he says, now, since I'm sober, I've been able to purchase 2 goats, and we sacrifice one for the festival each fall. He then says, for years and years while living in addiction, I had the drabbest house in the community, and my wife would always scold me and say, you're a painter, why is our house the ugliest in the neighborhood? He says, now that I am living in recovery, I've made sure that I've made our house the brightest in the community. And so this is the bright green that he painted his house. And then this is the last photo that he shows these primary care workers during the training. And he said that one of his clients asked him to paint whatever he wanted on the ceiling of their living room, and said, be creative, whatever you want to do. He says when he was living with addiction, his hand would shake so much, there was no way he could do anything beyond just kind of flat, drab colors. But now that he's sober, he's able to paint much more detail. And he said he painted this sky full of clouds and birds, because he thinks of the clouds as the resources of the healthcare providers in the community. And that when you're living with a mental illness, you're like dry ground, and nothing will grow out of dry ground. No crops, no vegetables, nothing that supports the community. But when you have good rains, then all kinds of crops can grow. And that he said, healthcare providers, like those in the room during this training, are the clouds of their community. They bring the rain, and they bring this fruitful development of people in that community. And he then ends by asking the primary care health workers in the training to be the clouds for others in the community like him and support them so that they can all thrive together. This is just a quick summary of that photo voice process. People get trained in photographic techniques. They then go take pictures of what matters to them about their experience of living with mental illness and recovery. They practice sharing these stories with other people living with mental health conditions. Then they give these stories to healthcare providers, community health workers in their communities. And then from there, hopefully those healthcare workers go on to provide better support to others because they see them as members of their community and have that empathic response. So we think, if this all goes well, that what we're using is this intergroup contact process that ultimately leads among the healthcare workers to their the threat and anxiety that might typically be evoked by interacting with somebody with a mental health condition to being less, which then means that more hope and empathy can be part of their response. And then because of that, they provide more services to people living with mental health conditions in their communities. So we've shown that by integrating people with mental health conditions and their photographic narratives in trainings, that there's a pretty drastic reduction in stigma from pre to post training over those 10 days. but that even more than a year later, at 16 months, these differences persist. What's striking is that these healthcare providers who are trained in this approach also deliver more mental health services, an average of 4 patients to every 3 in standard primary care mental health trainings. That when we looked at health facilities in the community, only half of the health facilities where there was standard training was still providing mental health services after a year, compared to 13 out of 16 in the arm with the photographic narrative stories. And most important, from a clinical perspective, the diagnoses were much more often correct among those healthcare workers who had gone through the training with the photographic recovery narratives. And most importantly, among those incorrect diagnoses, what is quite frightening, to be honest, is that many times there were false positives, meaning that a standard primary care training led to individuals often being diagnosed with a mental health condition when they didn't have it. And so we found, for example, every 2 people who actually had psychosis, there was 1 person who didn't have psychosis, who was started on antipsychotic medicine, given a label of living with psychosis, and potentially then were further stigmatized in the community. Similarly, for every 4 people accurately diagnosed with depression, 1 person was a false positive, meaning they were given this label, given medication when they didn't have the conditions. Compare this to the healthcare workers that were trained with more of this exposure to people living with mental health conditions and those photo recovery stories. Only 1 out of 20 individuals was a false positive for depression, and the rate was at least a little better with psychosis, 1 out of 5. Based on the success of this, we're now doing a much larger cluster randomized controlled trial in Nepal currently with over 72 health facilities and evaluating more than 6,000 patients to see whether this improved diagnosis is observed on a large scale. And based on the success, we've also had interest from a number of funders and are currently doing pilot projects in a number of places around the world, Beijing and Guangzhou. Here are a bunch of people living with mental health conditions in Beijing that are trained to give their photographic recovery stories. In Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, 2 sites in India, Bengaluru and Delhi, another site in Nepal and in Tunisia. There's also a more recent project exclusively focusing on people living with psychosis in Uganda. So in summary, if we think about consoling behaviors and supportive behaviors and the flow of empathy, we need to think about the fact that this doesn't happen ubiquitously and universally, but that there are aspects of group membership, group identity that lead to greater flow of empathy. And therefore, we need to think about ways that training can happen in order to facilitate ideas of shared identity, shared membership. One thing that I didn't discuss, but another important aspect of this is deciding who becomes a health worker and a mental health worker in the community. In the US, for example, we have very few minority psychiatrists and psychologists. So doing approaches like these at the community level is important, but we also need more specialists coming from diverse backgrounds to provide the most equitable care. If you're interested in reading more about this, we have an article published in 2020 that maps out our thinking on the process. Thank you all very much. Any questions, type of questions?
Thing for you, sorry. We did clap. Can we clap again for Brandon? Woo! Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much for this really fascinating talk. We have plenty of time for questions. So maybe Adam, you can monitor the chat. You have a question to start?
Yeah. Yeah, so I was interested that you started by kind of emphasizing this group membership, and I read your paper, and a lot of the paper is really talking about how, yeah, people in the in-group are sort of are the most important people to provide mental health care. And you mentioned like minorities as being a way to kind of, maybe ingratiate people or make them feel like they're part of the in-group. But I also wondered whether other aspects of becoming an in-group, like religion, can kind of cross, ethnic boundaries, or even, people with similar workplace backgrounds or whatever. I wonder if you thought more about, other aspects of community care that we could maybe use. in kind of training these people, especially if you can train them so quickly and effectively. Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And I think, we refer to this from a medical anthropology, Arthur Kleinman approach of kind of a what matters most idea. So what aspects of identity matter to a particular community, and can that be a potential starting point to leverage more empathy and compassion for people living with mental health conditions? So religion as a very, very important, which can be then kind of across ethnicities, other aspects of, say, professional experience, life stage, sexual orientation, other things such as even within a community, do individuals have children that are exposed to, part of the same school district, part of the same activities? It might be a form of bonding, something that they all want their kids to grow up in a safe community. So I think anything could be leveraged, and it's thinking about for a particular community, what can be done there. What we struggled with in Nepal is that very often, not only is there the dividing line in terms of not living with a mental health condition in terms of primary care workers, and then living with a mental health condition, but then also that's often divided by caste as well. So more often, high caste individuals will be care providers from a professional standpoint. And many of the people that we met and were willing to openly talk about it were from low castes. And so it was really important to talk about these shared rituals, shared festivals, regardless of caste. It would be something that's part of the mutual narrative of their experiences. So I think there are ways to overcome a lot of those differences, but it needs to be quite deliberate in the construction of these narratives.
Other questions yet tonight?
Thank you for the talk. I just have one question. So, did you try testing this intervention by showing videos of people having mental illnesses, but from other communities, just to see if there were negative effects? Because if the theory of in-group versus out-group is correct, then maybe like showing a person who belongs to other out-group should have like a potentially negative effect on stigma.
Yeah, so we didn't deliberately do that, and I think to test it, we would need to more specifically design an experiment like that. But we have evidence from a video-based study that does suggest that might be going on. So what we did was these individuals in southern rural Nepal, we had some of them actually make videos in addition to those photo narratives they presented in person, and then we showed those narratives to medical students in the capital city, Kathmandu. And what we found was that the depression video, which was a young woman, 18 years old, who went on to go to college, her narrative led to a reduction in depression-related stigma in these students as well. So we think that there's kind of this shared aspect of experience. The video of a person with psychosis, though, when we showed it to the students, their stigma got worse. They actually were less likely to then be willing to provide care for that individual. Now, this was an older individual, also of a different caste and ethnicity background, living in a rural area, not going to school, not educated like these medical students. So I wonder if that's playing a role. I can't definitively say that, but it was interesting to see those who saw the video versus not seeing the video were actually more likely to be stigmatizing, even though they heard that life narrative. And we've published a paper on that as well.
Thanks.
Can I follow up quickly? So do you think that the efficacy of this training could actually be something that we would bring back to kind of the US and the UK? Because we have such a shortage of mental health care providers, and it seems like if you can do something so quickly and effectively, and yeah, I mean, maybe they're not going to be psychiatrists who can prescribe medications, but yeah, it seems like it could be really useful. I'm also thinking of people with lived experience. It's often, we see that a lot in like addiction clinics in the UK, that you'll have people who do that, but it's much less common with psychosis and other conditions. So yeah, I wonder if you've thought about that.
Yeah, absolutely. We're doing a trial on that right now in New York City using an intervention that we had tested in Nepal and now focused on historically minoritized groups. So kind of Black New Yorkers, Latinx New Yorkers, other immigrant groups. and trying to do a community-based intervention, a brief 5-session psychological intervention. So there's kind of two aspects to your question. So one of them is, yes, I think there's more and more interest in these types of task sharing, task shifting strategies. We're getting community members to be able to do these things because they share more of that lived experience. We're more comfortable talking with them. It's interesting that the biggest barrier actually tends to be professional societies and reimbursement mechanisms. So in the US, the American Psychological Association, American Psychiatric Association, to get them on board with this, that, you know, some are supportive, but some see it as a threat. So those that kind of are highly professionalized groups, we would need more support for this to be widely scaled. And then also how reimbursement happens, because reimbursement, at least in the US, is, as everybody knows, a disaster, but it's based on kind of who's providing the care, not the care. So if a master's level counselor versus a psychiatrist versus a psychologist are all doing CBT, they get reimbursed differently because of their professional status. If somebody in the community who's a lay person delivers CBT, there's not a mechanism to reimburse them at all. That said, people want to change this. In the US, President Biden has pushed for more community-based services. The second part is also just the idea of incorporating more peers with lived experience, and that has been a push as well. Also moving beyond just the addiction space where it's commonly used and often does have some mechanisms for reimbursement, although it's low. So now we are seeing more peer helpers in the field of psychosis, and I think we'll hopefully see more of this in the future. I also hope that we can get, if I think of my own medical training, get more experiences for medical students and those in training about this type of shared experience, more engagement, as opposed to kind of the first person you see living with severe mental illness being institutionalized in a severe state where they're an object, they're not a partner in a conversation. So also how we train needs to be rethought.
Cool. Seems really important. Any last comments, questions? Otherwise we'll... Oh, Adrian?
I have a brief question. So I really liked your talk, and I like how you started out with kind of evolutionary considerations about who has empathy towards whom. So I was just curious, in this whole development, how if I'm not mistaken, you got your PhD in anthropology, right? Like how that particular training has kind of helped you envision this program.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there was a couple of issues that kind of came out for me, and one was just how understanding the experience of mental illness from an anthropological perspective became really important, and realizing some of the limitations in terms of how mental illnesses are described, the presentation, the types of healing. And, I'm someone who fundamentally believes there are shared characteristics across cultures of mental illness. There are also things that vary, but that often the ways that we were trying to get more mental health care globally are still pretty biased towards a biomedical clinical framing that might not properly capture everybody who needs care in the most effective way. And then I think the other aspect of this is I was trained at Emory University in a biocultural program. So there was a lot of focus on evolutionary theory as well, is that, again, this shared idea of, there's, I think, a lot of great progress in evolutionary psychiatry, but my feeling that it focused on where did the disorder come from? But we think in evolution of these, these are systems, right? That as something evolves, you have other changes within an organism, within a community, within an ecosystem. And that we kind of neglected in many ways that person responding to an individual who's expressing signs of distress or more severe disorder. So that's where I think the anthropological training really strongly informed that. And I know one of the things that you're presenting a lot in the conference, and I also do work on, has been around adapting how we best assess mental health conditions. That was part of my anthropology training as well, using mixed methods to better create tools that adequately capture who's in a state of psychological distress.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Let's thank Brandon again.